Good morning, church. Even though we've got many that are out for reasons of travel as well as health, it is good to see those of you who are here this morning. There are many people that we have on our prayer list, and even more recently. Please remember them in prayer, and don't forget those that are traveling, because this is it's a dangerous time. Lots of people travel and around this time, and they don't always do so responsibly. And so people can be chaotic and bring about their own troubles, as we know nothing about, right? I want to invite your attention to Mark chapter number 14 as we investigate the text with that title in mind, The Final Word. Mark chapter number 14. And what we're going to do, I need to let you guys know up there too that we're going to stop in verse 61. We'll read that part of the text, and then we'll come back through and work our way through it. But Mark chapter 14, and we'll begin reading in verse number 53. We'll read... I guess we'll read it all. There's only one less verse, so we'll read it, and then we'll come back and break it down. It says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. But Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple, made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, 'Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?' The Son of the blessed." I looked away and inserted memory from another verse. Verse number 62, Jesus said, 'I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven.'" I don't know, did I give verses 63 and 64? Or did I just, okay, let's keep reading, perfect. "Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' And they all condemned him to be deserving of death." Again, I want to labor under the topic, the final word. I have been revisiting some lessons lately, and it just so would happen that this beautiful passage, even though it's an infuriating one, it's such a beautiful text because Jesus did not bow down to the whims and the wills of the people. Jesus was not going to do this their way. And there was both a sense of defiance as well as, matter of fact, I want you to consider for a minute that they were losing this case. They had already lost the trial. And Jesus has to do something so drastic to put back on course his own crucifixion. As a matter of fact, they were losing it so badly because God over and over again was exposing in this trial both their hypocrisy, all of their lies, and how not just the vindictiveness of the people, but how pointless their attacks were. And all of their false accusations would come to nothing. They did not win the trial this day because of any of their false witnesses. They didn't win the trial this day because they had found some legal loophole to use against him. The only reason they won the trial this day is because you and I needed to be saved from our sins. And so it's really a beautiful depiction of how God has all control and man has absolutely none. Even up until the very end of this, man was not going to get his way. I want you to consider for a moment, too, that not only was this trial, this was an embarrassment. They were losing it. It sets a precedent for what I have yet to learn in my own life. And like Peter, God has to tell me 3 times most of the time. You know, they say trouble comes in threes, but so does rebuke, it seems. And there are things that I revisit that I thought I'd learned the lesson of or on. And it is simply this. You do not have to, number one, you do not have to answer every accusation. Nor do you have to defend every attack. As a matter of fact, you will get further and be more at peace if you allow God to do the same. Because what ends up happening is we end up defeating what could be a very victorious outcome. And we're going to learn that at the end of this, sometimes it's not going to be the victory we think it is. Sometimes we will have done nothing wrong. And sometimes people will lie on you. Sometimes they will try to trap you or entrap you. And they will resort to unscrupulous methods to do so. And sometimes God will allow them. I want to go back to the beginning of this because I want to point out some things along the way that I think are worthy of remembering. And Jesus really, this isn't going to be saturated with a ton of practical application, but there is going to be some. I want you to take a look with me again at, and we'll begin reading of verse number 53. It says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes." And I like the way that Mark records Peter's involvement here, because when you read what happens and what Peter does elsewhere, sometimes Peter is given a bad rap. And you got to remember, Jesus said, even the prophets foretold all that millennia ago that the shepherd would be struck and the sheep would scatter. Jesus, on repeated occasion, told them that when they come for him, that they would scatter, that they would all betray him, that they would all turn away from him. But he says, you will return. God will forgive you. And I imagine that every time Jesus said those things, it was probably so far out of reach and impossible to conceive of that they just probably didn't want to and refused to believe him when he told them. But here we are, and it says, Mark says, but Peter followed him at a distance. If you stop at a distance, it appears that Peter didn't want to be there, that Peter, but it says after the comma, right into the courtyard of the high priest. What that means is Peter placed himself in a position of danger because he wanted to be there for his Lord. And as a matter of fact, it's even possible that as he's warming his hands by the fire and he's there close enough to see the dialogue take place and what's transpiring, it's even possible that one of these servants that is there with him might even later be one of the servants on the third case who accuses him. We don't know. But Peter put himself in jeopardy, and he did so until the very end. It says, "Now the chief priest and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none." One of the things that they were not going to be able to do is God was not going to allow them to place any charge against Jesus that would stick. They were not going to paint him as a sinner. They were not going to paint him as the blasphemer that they wanted to, even though what Jesus is going to do is going to open that door. We'll get to that when we get to that. But God was not going to allow their attempts and their schemes to bear any fruit. And it's kind of funny, and no matter how many times God shows me this, I still wrestle with remembering in the moment that if I just close my mouth, most often people will expose their own duplicitous nature. People will expose their own hypocrisy, and God will defend you and the truth will come out. But most of the time, I feel like, is it just me, but there's this natural urge when I've done nothing wrong, I want to answer the accusation. I want to defend my own honor. I want to defend my name. I want to make sure that also people know that they are lying. And you know, one of the characteristics that would prove Jesus to be the Messiah is the way that Isaiah described him as the lamb who before the shearer was silent, who did not open his mouth. And all the humiliation and all of the beating and all of the spitting and all of the torture and accusation, and he didn't say a word. And if there was anyone at any time who that overwhelming, compelling feeling to speak up, Jesus has it more than anyone. And he didn't open his mouth. And I'm starting to learn that there are many reasons why, chief amongst them, why you don't open your mouth is because when you do open your mouth, you end up putting pause. You press the pause button on what God is doing on your behalf because you don't submit and trust in him and allow him to defend you. And sometimes there is a defense that would come to the same conclusion as this one. Oftentimes, when there are lies, the lies don't agree. Jesus, and even when here's the crazy thing, even when they told the truth. Now it says that right before it says that they talked about the temple being destroyed, number one, Jesus said that to his 12. And I'm not sure, I've never really figured out how they found out about that, but I'm sure the conversation got out from those there that day. But he didn't say that to the community. He said that to his own 12 apostles. But they said, we heard it. We heard him say it. And it calls them false witnesses beforehand, even though they're telling a portion of truth. And because their motives and their intent were wrong and duplicitous, God does not allow it to be successful. And that is one of the things I have wrestled with for years, and remembering in the moment that all you have to do is allow people to dig their own holes, as they say, to tie their own ropes, and if I'm quiet long enough, people will begin to see it. But, and here's the second reason. Even when you're telling the truth, you can do it the wrong way. You can mess up. Let me explain how. I don't mean how you say a thing. I mean that there is a reason that in this country we have a thing called a Miranda right. You have to know that you have the right to remain silent, because everything you say can and will be used against you. And here's the thing. Any attorney, and I am not one, this is not legal advice, this is what any attorney will tell you. Do not speak. Do not open your mouth. And I'm not talking about necessarily even a criminal case. You can have a home invasion. Attorneys will tell you what seemingly would be, at least in Texas, a clear-cut self-defense situation. Someone invades your home at night, and you have to protect your family, and it results in loss of life. Even in a situation like that, every attorney worth the plaque on their wall will tell you, do not speak to anyone. Do not talk to law enforcement. I don't care what they say until you have spoken to an attorney. Do not say anything. They will all tell you the first thing you need to do is say, I want to cooperate and I want to give you a testimony, but I cannot do that until I speak to my attorney. And then I will give you my statement. Cooperate, and then shut down. They'll even tell you you're giving a statement every time you open your mouth to different people. The first one they'll tell you that is introduced into court when you go to court is the 911 call. So you know what attorneys tell you to do? Say, I need EMS and I need law enforcement, please, and hang up the phone. It is not against the law in any state to hang up on a 911 operator. And they'll call you back. And so that's what attorneys tell you to do, because that's your very first statement that's going to be introduced as evidence. And guess what? The truth, because maybe you said it with too much excitement, they'll pick apart the inflection in your tone. They will use it as evidence against you, even though what you said is exactly what happened. I thought I was going to die, and I had to pull the trigger. They'll say, no, don't say that. Just hang up the phone. Don't give any specifics. And in my mind, I'm thinking, why? Because Jeff thinks he knows better, right? I'm not talking in that situation. I'm talking in other given ones. And so your own words can and will be used against you. Even retired law enforcement will tell you that nice investigator, there's no such thing as presumed innocence. They will tell you, even law enforcement retired, do not talk to law enforcement until you talk to your attorney. And the reason for this is plain. The devil will use the truth even against you. He does it in our heads all the time. He distorts Scripture. It ought to have been evident and plain by now. And it's funny because we don't ever notice it when he's doing it. We'll say what we're supposed to say, and someone won't like what we said or how we said it. Let me give you an example. It reminds me of this brother. This guy was going to go on vacation out of town. And he has a brother who was going to watch over his apartment. And he says, while I'm gone, each day I'll call home and I'll check. I promise I'll call every day. He was going out of the country. So he has a cat. And he calls on the first day. And he gets his brother on the phone. And first thing his brother tells him is, hey, I'm sorry, man, but your cat died. And after he is able to reconcile what he just heard, and he's devastated, he says, come on, bro. He says, you had to tell me like that? He goes, you couldn't, let me down easy? Or give me time to process it? He goes, what do you mean? What'd I do? He says, you could have told me today the cat's on the roof. Tomorrow when I called, you could have said, well, he fell off and I took him to the vet. And then on the next day, you could have said, he didn't make it. Give me time to process all this. And he says, I'm sorry, bro. I didn't realize. I'll do better. I'm sorry. He says, thank you. Next day he calls back. He wants to check on everybody. Lets everybody. He says, I'm doing good out here. I just wanted to see how everybody's doing. How's the old homestead? How's mom? He says, mom's on the roof. Even when there's always going to be someone that no matter what you say, no matter how you say it, someone will misinterpret what you have to say and your intent behind it. They tried to do this to Jesus, and watch how God defeated them every time. So much so that if Jesus didn't do what he's about to do in verse 62, Jesus would have never been crucified based on the laws of the land. They couldn't find any two people who could lie the same lie, nor could they find two people to tell the same truth. Isn't that something? And it says in verse number 56, it says, for many more false witnesses against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Drop down to verse number, we'll do 59 and we'll keep going. Because I want to go one other place and then the lesson is yours. That's not true. Two other places and then the lesson is yours. Verse number 59 says, but not even then did their testimony agree. Not even when they were citing what Jesus did say, even if they tried to distort what he said. or change it to fit their narrative. Even then, they couldn't agree on what he said. This was so evident in this trial that Jesus has to say what he's about to say. You get to verse number 60. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. And the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Verse number 62 is where everything changes. And I want you to appreciate why Jesus did what he did. This had to happen. And it was almost like the last sense of defiance that you wicked men are not going to get away with what you're doing. And I'm not surrendering, or you guys are not convicting me of anything. I am offering my life. And in this very last moment, he says what he didn't need to say. What in other ways, oftentimes, he would discourage others from repeating until after this was all done. And that is that he is not just the Christ, he's God in the flesh. This is really a beautiful moment because this is where the trial takes a turn. Verse number 62 says, Jesus answered, "I am." There's a reason there's a period after that. This was not just a confirmation of what the high priest just said to Jesus. The Greek here is ego eimi, E-G-O-E-I-M-I, which is used a few other times in the New Testament. You will see this in the Greek when Jesus, what we call the I am statements. I am the truth. I am the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. And in each one of those cases, they bear a striking similarity, one that is often overlooked. And it's not a confirmation, it is a declaration. Ego eimi is a transliteration of what happened in Exodus chapter 3. In Exodus chapter 3, when Moses was to be sent to Pharaoh to tell him what God had to say, "Let my people go that they may serve me." When Moses said, "Well, when I go to the people and when I go to Pharaoh, why would they believe me? Who do I say sent me?" He said, "Tell him I am sent you. I am that I am." You see, in every Israelite on that day, as well as every Jew listening this day, knew that a basic confirmation of truth was not ego eimi. Ego eimi was making the declaration that God made to Moses. And so when they heard this, immediately, even if Jesus said nothing else except ego eimi, they would have known he was declaring that I am the God of the Old Testament. Jesus was declaring to them that day that just as, and when you go, matter of fact, let's go there now, because I think I did put this one. In John chapter 8, not to Exodus, because John is going to quote Exodus. John chapter 8, and I want you to see how he does it in relation to their connection and lack thereof to Abraham. John chapter 8 and verses 57 through 59. Check this out. Then the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" Because they were arguing that they didn't need him and they didn't need the gospel because they've got Abraham and they've got their lineage and they've got their foot into heaven and they didn't need anything Jesus was preaching. Jesus says things like, "Abraham saw this day and I saw his, and Abraham wouldn't recognize you." And he's later going to say, matter of fact, he's not even your father. Your father is the devil. Keep going. Verse number 58. Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, before Abraham Genomai, Genomi, that word means to come into existence. It means, very literally, to be born. It means, the reason I emphasize come into existence is because of what the next phrase means. He said, before Abraham came into existence, Genomai, he says, I am, ego eimi. I have always been. Even though Abraham was created, There's never a time I wasn't already past tense. I have always been. And so when Jesus said this, look at their response. They knew exactly what I am meant. Verse 59. You know, in this spot, Jesus didn't say, I am the Christ, Son of the living God. He didn't say yes to any question confirming that. All he said was, before Abraham was, I am. And this is what they understood that to mean. Then they took up stones to throw at him. Why? But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. You see, they recognized blasphemy in his statement, because in their minds, to consider oneself the Christ is to say, I am God, because there is no variation. Because you cannot be a begotten of God. You cannot be God in the flesh or family of God without yourself being, in very nature, God. So they said, this is blasphemy, kill him. Now fast forward back to where we are. Jesus says these words on trial, so there's no way that they can misunderstand what he's saying to them. Go back now and we'll read this one more time. Oh, and then we got one more verse after this in 1 Corinthians. I forgot. It says in verse 62 of Mark chapter 14, I'm sorry, I'm back and forth for the ladies. I usually give them the order in which I'm going to do this, and I forgot to this morning. Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This is the most descriptive, both confirmation and declaration of his identity that he has given. The only one that even comes close to it. It was a blessed privilege that a Samaritan woman got in John chapter 4 in a private conversation. When she said to him, when that one they call Christ, when the Messiah comes, the one they call Christ, he'll explain everything to us. He said, I who speak to you am he. This is the only other place where Jesus unambiguously and definitively, unequivocally said, yes, I am the Son of God. I am God in the flesh. Now, there's a reason he had to do this, church. And it's found in 2 Corinthians. They would not have crucified him. I want, and I hope that this may be, if you don't already, have not already considered this under this light, I hope that that changes today. 1 Corinthians, my bad. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And verses 7 through 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 through 9. If you were to read prior to verses 7 through 9, chapter 1 is a little bit different. They're arguing over preachers and personalities, and they're creating factions in the church and causing division. You get to chapter 2, and by the time you're in chapter 2, Paul has already been defending that, number one, none of these men that you are attaching yourselves to would endorse what you're doing right now. Not Paul, not Apollos, not Cephas, not Jesus. All of them would denounce every one of you for trying to pit each other against each other. Not only would they do that, he says, none of them except one died for you. And then he says, I'm thankful that I didn't baptize none of y'all except one of you. And he's not here in this argument. Then you keep going, and Paul starts talking about when he came preaching the gospel, that's all he preached. Which is the same thing that Apollos, the gifted orator, that gifted speaker, he says, Apollos didn't come to you and do what Jesus did, nor did I. He says, all I came doing was preaching the gospel. And he says, you might like the way he preaches better or prefer the way that I do. He says, but all of that matters none. He says, because we lift up Jesus and we preach him crucified. And then he starts talking about that gospel message, that it is foolishness to the Greeks. It's a stumbling block to the Jews. Matter of fact, he would go on to say in another place that it is only foolishness to those who are perishing. But he's talking about the preaching of the gospel. And then you get to our verses right here in 7 through 9. And look at what he says about that same gospel. He says it's been veiled. It was hidden for such a long time. Why? Even while he was speaking, it had just become made known. He says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery. He's talking about God's plan to save mankind. That's the mystery that Paul illuminates in Ephesians, that in ages past God has kept secret, but in these last days he has made it manifest through the church. He says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages of our glory. God had ordained how he was going to save man before he said, let there be. However, he didn't tell man for a long time. And here's why. Which none of the rulers, he said, of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. I used to read this and think that if they truly knew who Jesus was, these Jews wouldn't have killed him. No, that's not what Paul's saying, because many of them did know who he was and still killed him. This is saying if they understood the consequences of killing him, they wouldn't have crucified him. That's what Paul's saying. They were so beside themselves in hatred, as they still are today. They hate Jesus and they hate his followers. They were so beside themselves with hatred that if they knew that crucifying him was actually God's plan, and that that's what was going to bring Jew and Gentile together in one body, that was what was going to erase their argument, into heaven because of their lineage. If that was going to do all of that, out of spite, they wouldn't have killed him. That's what Paul is saying here. And that became very clear and evident in Jesus' trial. And at the end of it, Jesus has to let the cat out of the bag because they can't get the job done, because evil does not succeed. And so he has to tell them and give them something they can actually use because they're losing the trial. And he says, I am. He says, unequivocally, I am the Christ. I am God in the flesh. And then the high priest says, we don't even need any more witnesses. Why do we need a witness? You've all heard the blasphemy with your own ears. And that was the basis through which they crucified him. What a beautiful concept that Jesus, who wrestled with doing this, do you remember the Garden of Gethsemane? Where he was wrestling with not wanting to go through with what he went through with. He was tempted to not do it. That's what temptation is. It can't be called temptation if you don't possess the capability to do it. So he could have said no. He was in agony because he knew what was coming in a way we can't conceive of. He could see the future. I imagine he could also feel it before. He could, in that moment in the garden, probably feel every stripe on his back, every hole in his body, and what they were going to do, all of the torture, the humiliation, the pain. And the Bible says it was so intense that he sweat blood. He said, if it be thy will, Father, let this cup pass from me. I don't want to do it. If there's any other way we can do this, other than this, please let it happen. But he said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. I want to close with that thought that he went through with it anyway. And even when they were losing the trial, he made sure that the devil didn't win. And he gave them all the evidence. That's like someone making a confession at the last minute when they're about to get an innocent verdict. An acquittal. Opening up their mouth with a brand new testimony. I changed my mind, I did it. If you're here, maybe you have, like me, been wrestling with not remembering that you do not have to answer every accusation. You do not have to defend every attack. And truth be told, wisdom would dictate when you do, you end up disrupting a beautiful ordeal that God might put on display and even wow you with if you just trust him. And just like we saw with Jesus, sometimes it's going to mean that, no, it's going to appear that they've won, but they have not. And for whatever purpose it serves that God allows it to happen, he still has not abandoned you. He has not left you, and they're not victorious in their lies, and their deceit has not made the day. God knows exactly what happened, and you just keep trusting in him, and you keep your mouth closed, and you allow him to vindicate you. because he is a loving God and he will defend his people, even if it's in judgment. If you're here and you are not a member of the body of Christ, man, that ought to have impressed you, the lengths that God went to, and we just barely scratched the surface. That he made sure that there was no way that the devil could keep him from the cross. I don't know about you, but if I'm wrestling with doing this ahead of time and you give me an out, they were losing the trial. Jesus had to put it back on course for the fate of all humanity. That ought to convince you of our loving God. And if it's not enough and you want to know more, or you would like to know what that means for you, come forward and ask to be shown in God's Word, and we will study together what God says you must do to spend eternity with him in heaven. If you are a Christian and would request prayer, don't feel bad. You don't even have to tell us what it's about. And nobody's going to make any assumptions, I hope. And if they do, that's between them and God. Remember, you just don't worry about it. You keep your mouth closed. But come on up and ask for prayer, and we'll pray together with you. The truth is, every one of us in here needs it more than we admit. Please let those needs be known now together as we stand. Will you come?